It is Monday here on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I'm your host, Chris Carter, and it is Steelers training camp week. The Steelers report to practice on Wednesday. Myself and Brian Batko are going to talk to you about all the big things that you should be thinking about heading into their first day of training camp. Plus, we'll have some baseball talk with Noah Hiles as the Pirates have been looking a lot better recently. It's going to be a big episode here on the North Shore Drive podcast. Let's get into it. You are now listening to the North Shore Drive Podcast, a show on all things Pittsburgh sports from the writers of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, hosted by Christopher Carter. Hello and welcome to the North Shore Drive Podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I'm your host, Chris Carter. As always, bringing you your show here every Monday, Wednesday, Friday on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this channel to get all of the Monday, Wednesday, Friday episodes of the North Shore Drive Podcast, as well as the daily content that comes out from all of our Pittsburgh sports writers here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, including Brian Batko, who joins me today talking Steelers here as training camp week is upon us. As we are now in the final week of July here. As always, this show is brought to you by Mike's Beer Bar, the best bar in Pittsburgh. When you go to Mike's Beer Bar, there were 500 different available beers. 300 of those beers are from the local Pittsburgh area, and 80 of those local beers are available on tap. It's the best bar in Pittsburgh. We'll tell you more about that later. Brian, let's get into some training camp talk here. First of all, welcome back. We're both back from a little bit of vacation. We got to enjoy some time off before we dive into the sweaty, hot, unforgiving sun that will be over Latrobe for the next month or so as we cover training camp. But it's always interesting every year to see, like, we're going into what are the big things people worry about. But this topic, I think, is one of the more least talked about things we've seen over the past couple of weeks, because everyone's kind of been just thinking about, you know, the position battles, you know, what are the roster moves? Are they going to trade for Brandon Ayuk? But everyone seems to be forgetting, what about the potential of certain guys doing hold-ins like we've seen over the past few years? And there's a few really important players who are in position that they could do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those situations where nobody's at the level of TJ Watt when he did it a few years ago out in Latrobe, and it seemed like every day we're trying to get updates on the contract negotiations. And then at one point, I think it was actually when they came back from St. Vincent, maybe on the south side, Keith Butler was the former DC. It was sort of like, yeah, we know what he's doing. It's fine. We want him to get paid. So it was like, all right, there's no end in sight really. But then it was even a little thornier a couple years ago when Deontay Johnson did it. It's kind of like, all right, we know you want a new deal. We know you're probably deserving of one. You're not TJ, you know, you have a Pro Bowl on your resume, but you're not TJ Watt. And yet, whether that forced the Steelers' hand or it just coincidence that they did hammer something out, you know, that ended up being water under the bridge. But then you have recent cases of guys like Minkah Fitzpatrick and Alex Highsmith pretty much getting taken care of before that could really become an issue. And I think that was part of the reasoning too, was they didn't want to have to deal with any of those, you know, leverage plays in camp. This year, you've got a trio of guys really who stand out to me that, you know, could theoretically go this route if they choose to. Cam Hayward being the big one. We already know that he withheld some of his participation in the optional OTAs portion, at least for the first couple of weeks back in the spring. No indication that that he's going to be less than available in training camp, but we already know, I mean, he's the oldest player on the team. He's probably going to get plenty of maintenance days just to manage his workload and his body anyway. But, you know, will we see him in any of those full team drills as he seeks a new deal? I don't know. The second one is Pat Freiermuth, tight end entering the last year of his deal. I've been pretty optimistic about he and the Steelers coming to an agreement since last season ended, and I'm not going to move off of that. And maybe it is a sign that is trending in the right direction, that you're not getting any leaks from Pat or anybody in his camp that, you know, he won't do everything in Latrobe, and he's going to hold out for, and maybe it's an indication the other way that they aren't close, and he also doesn't have that kind of leverage. I look at the tight end room and seem to think he would, but we'll see what happens there. All these guys expected to stop and chat at some point on Wednesday when they arrive at Rooney Hall. And then the third one would be Najee Harris, who, declined his 5th-year option. We've talked a lot on this show about how maybe that's a good thing for him personally in the long run. The Steelers obviously think it was the right move for them as an organization, both now and later. But we haven't heard from him since that. We've heard from coaches and players say he seems like he's in great spirits. Morale is high, but you just never know until you get it from the guy himself. And he's somebody who has dealt with injuries in training camp before, and we know how durable he's been, but we know he also needs to stay healthy to keep that, future earning power on his side in the league.
Absolutely. And I think part of this is why I think that it's been a little bit quieter about this is that tight end has not been a major demand position except for without a few exceptions in the NFL. And Pat Freiermuth, whereas he can be a very important part of the Steelers offense. Nobody looks at him and sees that he's in the class of Kelsey or Hawkinson or Kittle just yet. Now, maybe he's in the class just under them, but I think that he hasn't had the chance in the Steelers offense to take off in a way that makes him a dominating player. And maybe that's more so about the quarterback play that he's had the first 3 years of his career,
or the coaching,
or the offensive coaching. Exactly. So maybe that plays into a role here. But you look at some of those guys that I think would be in the realm of what he could be looking to make here, like, a Dalton Schultz, a Noah Fant. They're hovering around $10 million a year. And that's not like what it would take to probably sign a George Pickens, who probably could be in the upper teens of per year money that he could sign with the Steelers the year after. So I feel like part of Pat Freiermuth and why things aren't as loud there is because tight end is a less expensive position to sign, and I think that there's more of okay, we could see the Steelers figuring that out. Najee Harris, I think, is kind of the story that everyone's kind of looking at to see, because first of all, we didn't even talk to him during training camp or during OTAs and mini camp. He did not want to talk to the media, and we're still waiting to hear from him. I doubt we hear from him when he comes into the Steelers, when he reports to camp right away.
Well, he did. He did last year. That was when he sort of went on maybe his most insightful spiel about the running back market. And I do, though, remember, Chris, during that little scrum, right as everybody checks in there with their suitcases and their luggage a year ago on this week, he really, really avoided questions about what he would have to prove in 2023 to get that option year picked up. So, I mean, maybe he was just trying to keep the main thing, but in retrospect, it was a bit ominous that he was not at all willing to go down that road. Maybe he knew even back then that it might not be in the cards for him. And again, it could end up being good for him, but he's really left it sort of open-ended on how people can interpret his feelings about, he could have 2 years left on his deal. Instead, he only has one. Does he approach this camp any differently? Did he approach his offseason any differently? All lingering questions that may or may not be answered by Najee when he rolls up on Wednesday. If you've been curious about how this works in the past, I mean, it's generally like players are checking in, they're unloading their stuff, they're getting their bearings about them, especially the guys who've never been there. And all of us media types are just standing there on the grassy knoll, sticking recorders in their face and trying to ask them questions. So not every guy will even partake in that. There's ways to sneak around the back. There's ways to wait it out and come in a little bit later. So maybe he'll be in that group, and potentially the first time we get a chance to chat with him could be first practice of camp on Thursday.
Could very well be that. I want to talk more about this and the impact that it could have, and as well as how other things could play into the factors of players holding in and what that could look like in training camp. We'll do that and more next here on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. But first, we'll remind you, the show is brought to you by Mike's Beer Bar, the best bar in all of Pittsburgh. When you go to Mike's Beer Bar, it's down on the North Shore, right across the street from PNC Park. It's amazing because they have outdoor seating and indoor seating. They got AC if you want to stay cool. You get to see the Pittsburgh skyline right on Federal Street across the street from PNC Park as you're you're sitting there, you can see the Clemente Bridge. If you're down in the North Shore enjoying a Pirates game, you can go there before, during, after. It's an amazing experience because you get to choose one of 500 different available beers. 300 of those beers are for the local Pittsburgh area, and 80 of those local beers are available on tap. You can get amazing beer flights to get whatever kind of flavors that you want to experience. They also have amazing food like steak on a stone, where you get your choice cut of steak brought to you on a heated stone, and every time you cut off a piece, all you have to do is press it into the stone to choose how well done you want every single bite. It is the best bar in Pittsburgh. Go there today, and when you get there, tell them Chris sent you. We're back here in the North Shore Drive podcast on the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter here with one of our great Steelers beat reporters, Brian Batko. Brian, let's get back to the Najee Harris thing here. Whereas, yes, this is the last year of his contract, and I'm sure that he is looking for a deal. Would holding in even really put him in a good position? Because whereas I think like Deontay Johnson did it, he was clearly the number one guy, and whereas George Pickens was coming up in a few years, there was he was kind of going to be the guy for a reason. When TJ Watt did it, he was arguably the best defensive player in football at the time. Everyone was talking about him like that. When Alex Highsmith did it, they needed a number 2 edge rusher. But Najee Harris is in a unique position where Jaylen Warren is behind him, and there's already a lot of people in town who think that Jaylen Warren could even be the better running back already, let alone the guy there. Could holding in be something that actually hurts Najee Harris if he just gives more chance for Jaylen Warren to show that he, show his skills and that he could be the number 1 guy in this Steelers offense?
I don't think so. I mean, the Steelers already know what Warren can do, and I think they've made a tacit admission about how much they value him by not picking up that option for Najee Harris. I mean, just the bang for your buck there on Warren as a third-year undrafted guy versus a fourth-year first-round pick. The efficiency numbers for Warren are just so good, and yeah, I mean they know what he can do. They know they're also a good 1-2 punch. So I do think that Najee's still a very integral piece of this offense and a big part of what this team wants to do and is trying to accomplish in 2024. I mean, I think Warren's a really good change of pace back. I think he's really productive in basically every opportunity he gets, but I think there's also something to be said for having that innings eater, if you will, as the number 1 guy, the bigger back in Najee, who pushes the pile, wears the defense down. I mean, we've seen Jalen spin off plenty of tackles too, and rip off 3 or 4 really physical, bruising runs in a row. But I think I don't think he is quite as punishing for defenders as Najee Harris is when he's hitting the right holes and bowling people over. So I think those two are really good as a tandem. And I mean, as far as would it hurt him or help him? I mean, I just think for any running back, and maybe both of these guys will be treated as such by the Steelers anyway, to not have them getting too much physical taxing work in camp, because you want to keep those bodies fresh for the regular season, because they are just such key pieces of everything. They're going to be the engines that make this offense go. And whether it's Najee, whether it's Freiermuth, whether it's Cam Hayward, like, I don't think anybody's going to stage what TJ Watt was able to do a few years ago with his contract coming up was like, hey, I'm not doing anything other than my work on the side, because we know you guys need to pay me. We know you're going to pay me. I'm trying to get as much as I possibly can on that pivotal second contract for any NFL player. This is not that. This would maybe be, hey, maybe hold these guys out a little bit more than they normally would. Just be smart about it. And if the contract comes, the contract comes. So, there's some balls in the air that the Steelers and these players have to juggle, but it's a business. Guys have made business decisions, and so has the team in these last few years since Omar Khan became GM.
I think it would behoove the Steelers to see Najee Harris, right, from start to finish, be in camp. Like, my whole thing is, like, I could see, if he held out Jaylen Warren still being the guy, but I agree with you. The Steelers need Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren this year to be a 1-2 punch, and an effective 1-2 punch, because the running offense is supposed to be the part of the offense that makes this a lot easier on Russell Wilson, on George Pickens, on whoever's going to be the number 2 wide receiver on this team. And it's going to take a group effort to do that, along with the offensive line that needs to come along. And so I do think having him fully ready here, it was another reason why I thought the 5th-year extension for Najee Harris, to me, was at least like a no-brainer, was to say, hey, if you can keep that guy for a 5th year for $6.7 million, which would be like the 14th most paid running back in the NFL, it's kind of worth it for a guy that's been very consistent for you. But that's why I'm very intrigued by how Omar Khan is handling this situation as a general manager, how this is going to look moving forward. But you look at Najee Harris, you look at Pat Freiermuth, but you also have to look at Cam Hayward. He was a guy who didn't show up into the initial part of OTAs before he did eventually show up.
Yeah, he couldn't help himself. He had to be there. He knew like what his strategy was from a player negotiation side. And then after 2 weeks, he's like, I can't do this anymore. I need to be there with the guys. So that would probably make you skeptical that he's going to be anything less than 100% to the extent that they want him to be in camp reps. I mean, at this point, like, he's got nothing to prove. He doesn't need to be sparring with first and second year guys and one-on-one O-line, D-line drills. I mean, maybe he'll take a crack at the vets like Isaac Seumalo or James Daniels at certain points, or maybe he will want to mix it up with the draft picks. But yeah, for the most part, I think I would not be surprised if this is just how Cam is at camp, Chris. Like, he's usually the first one to sort of pick a fight. And when a rookie O lineman's getting his feet wet with first team or second team reps, it's usually big 97 who's kind of pushing it to the limit, to the whistle. And he's trying to bring out the best in those guys. And he's just a little bit of a natural hardo, and he gets hot under the collar. I think you might see less of that from him this year, for his own sake, preserving the body, but also because the Steelers know what he went through health-wise and injury-wise last year. Let's just make sure we can keep this guy, what does Tomlin say, airmail him to the regular season, if you will.
Yeah, I think that everyone knows who Cam Hayward is. He doesn't, like you said, he doesn't have much to prove. But I think this would have been much more of a worry point, I think, for the Steelers if he didn't report to OTAs and then show up there and be a presence there. Now, will Cam Hayward be practicing every day? Like you said, I think they're going to lean off. I'm more intrigued, and we'll get into this later in the week on Wednesday when we're actually about to go to see them report to training camp and what we expect to see. I think for that guy who challenges the offensive line, I think Keanu Benton could play a big role in that, because him versus guys like Zach Frazier, that could be a major thing to watch that we'll have to look at there at training camp. We'll get you all of those previews and all those battles looked at when we get more.
That'd be a good topic for Wednesday, Chris. Maybe we should take bets on first fights, first camp scuffles. I mean, you don't see as much of them until they go to pads. But I mean, hey, even unpadded Thursday, there could be some pushing and shoving, something that could qualify as a fracas. So maybe we'll put our odds on that.
Herbing and Leal, that's minus 250 right there, because they always go at it. We'll talk more about that on Wednesday, but we got to switch to some Pirates talk with Noah Hiles, as the Pirates have been on a roll lately. We'll get more of that here on the North Shore Drive podcast for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Stick with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I'm your host, Chris Carter. We switched topics to the Pittsburgh Pirates, where one of our great beat reporters, Noah Hiles, has been on the scene. And Noah, the Pirates have been on a bit of a run. Yes, it did, kind of get stopped. Their 6-game win streak got stopped by the Phillies on Sunday with a 6-0 loss. But before that, they were playing pretty well. They took 2 out of 3 with one of the best teams in all of baseball against the Phillies. And now all of a sudden, you look at the standings and they're above 500. They're still right in the thick of the wild card race. In fact, a half game out of the wild card place. I think it's really interesting, Noah, here to look at what they've done. What have you seen that's most impressed you about this run and the rise they've had to get here?
It's more them being able to continue doing the things that they need to win ball games, Chris. I think what we saw Sunday was something that we would see once every series rather than once a week. And that's the difference between an average team and a good team. Is even the best teams in baseball, the Phillies are a perfect example of this. They'll have a dud where the bats don't show up, their starting pitching doesn't look great, their bullpen doesn't hold its end of the bargain. That's baseball. I mean, everyone's going to lose at least 60 games a year, if not more. But what separates the average teams from the good teams is how far can you space those off
Right.
days. And the Pirates would always seemingly have one off day, 2 good days, then 2 off days, two good days, and that's their first off day in about 2 weeks. And that's the difference. They're doing the little things that you need to do to win baseball games. They're hitting well with runners on base. They're running the bases well. They're fielding well. They're making the pitches they need to make in tight situations with runners on, or pitching around guys that serve as potential danger at the plate from the opposition. They're checking all the boxes. And this is, I think, what even kind of makes the first half of the season seem more frustrating, is because this team's been here all along. It's not like, a whole new crop of players showed up, but still, in the grand scheme of things now, this team is 6 games over 500 since Skeens first pitched on May 11th. It just took a little bit of time for them to hit their stride. And this is how they're going to need to play for the remainder of the year if they want to stay in this. They can't have another stretch like they had in April or early May. They have to play above 500 ball if they want to stay in the mix, because the teams that they're competing with, the Cardinals, the Braves, the Diamondbacks, I mean, they're not going to slow down. So the Pirates have to keep this going, and it'll be interesting because they have their work cut out for them with their upcoming schedule.
They absolutely do. They got some tough teams coming up. But I also look at this, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this. I feel like part of what's going on here, Noah, is the Pirates needed leadership. They needed guys, not even just like superstar leadership, but just locker room guys. We said that, a couple of years back and last year, and they seem to have those guys. They seem to have those guys that can help steady things out a little bit more this year. And it kind of leads me into thinking, like, you got some good role players, you got some good leadership guys, but you still need the pieces to complete this roster. How much does their recent performance, do you think, impact the chance of being buyers who are willing to add to this roster, and not in a menial way, in maybe a significant way that could help them solidify themselves as a playoff team in the coming months?
I don't think it changed a ton. I think that they were probably going to do the same thing they were going. I don't think they were really ever going to be sellers. I think at worst they were going to be buyers and sellers at the same time. And that was, I don't know how realistic even that was. I think they might have considered it at certain points, when they were dropping down to 5 games under. I think we might have trended that way had things not gone right in Milwaukee and Chicago prior to the All-Star break, when they went 2-4 in that homestand against, or 2-4 or 3-4, excuse me, against the Mets and the Cardinals, where they took 3 of the 7 games there, and they dropped down below 500, or 5 games below 500. That might have set them on a course where they could have ended up being sellers. And I think that that's where that talk went, was everyone just kind of assumed, like, okay, this is where this is trending. They're going to have to sell. But I think the goal was always for them to buy. It's just how serious were they going to buy? And I think that they're still on that level now, where I don't see them making a huge splash move, but they're going to add to the roster. And honestly, when you look at what's available right now, Carter, it doesn't make sense for them to go out and sell the farm, because I don't know if there's one specific player you can go out and get that will make this team tremendously better. The way this team's going to have to win games is by getting better efforts from the guys here. That's just the reality of it. They need if Jack Sawinski and Ke'Bryan Hayes can play to their potential in the second half, this team probably makes the playoffs. That's what it's going to have to come down to. And sure, they definitely could use a bat. They could use one. And I'm not sitting here saying that a guy like Jazz Chisholm or Luis Robert wouldn't make this team a lot better, but I don't know if it would make sense to pay the price that those guys will cost, simply because, I don't know if this is a team that can win the World Series, and that's the type of move you make if you're really trying to go all in. And I don't think that move makes them a World Series contender. So I just see them still buying at the deadline, nothing crazy, but they've just got to add to this roster and they've just got to keep playing the way they're playing. I mean, if you can just get the guys that you projected to have decent seasons to play better in the second half, that's going to do it. I think and Cherington said this, I think what this recent streak did was confirm what the front office thought was, hey, this team as it was assembled can play good baseball. And maybe it just needed a little bit of time together to get clicking. And if it can continue to get those contributions, you add in a little bit, that will take it to the next level right there.
I could hear that. But you brought this up too, about being buyers and sellers.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it makes them less sellers of guys like Tellez or like Chapman?
Yeah.
Okay.
Those guys, I mean, yeah, that's, I guess I didn't completely get, when I hear seller, I think like you're not doing anything to add. You're just selling off parts. And I don't think that was ever part of the equation.
Okay.
I think there was a chance that they might have done a little bit of both, where they might have sold a Chapman, but also brought in a bat. But no, the only guys they might offload at the deadline would be someone like maybe like a Martin Perez. And that's simply, and I don't think that makes them worse. I think it's just, they have 8 starting pitchers and they don't have room for 8 starting pitchers, and he's the worst of the group. So that would be my assessment there. And I if we were to see another big league player dealt from this roster, it could be something that, and Cherington talked about this Sunday, where because there are so few sellers in this deadline, because everyone's in playoff contention, we might see deals between 2 teams in playoff contention saying, hey, we have a lot of depth in the outfield.
Right.
You have a lot of starting pitching depth. Why don't we trade you our 4th best outfielder for your 6th best starting pitcher? And that guy would be a top 5 pitcher on our team. That guy would be a top 3 outfielder on your team. Stuff like that. I think that's where they might be in territory wise if they were to deal guys off their big league roster, but they're not looking to sell off assets with the best interest of the future now. It's more they're completely focused on 2024.
I hear that entirely. I do think it's going to be interesting to see what they end up to be moving. I think that's all Pittsburgh's waiting to see, because I think another thing, Noah, here is fans seem to be buying in. Like, I know that there was the Philly presence was a big part of the crowds this weekend, but as you reported, they had the biggest crowd they've had since 2015. I believe it was the Friday game this past weekend. And it does seem like fans are building their excitement, not just for Paul Skeens, but for this team in general. And it kind of makes me think maybe it would be worth it to be buyers. And one thing this team could really do to continue to inspire that is to win this series against the St. Louis Cardinals, a team that is in position to get the wild card. They're a game and a half ahead in the wild card chase right now, 2 games ahead of the Pirates itself. What do you expect to see in this series between these 2 teams? I believe you have Mitch Keller on the mound today, Monday, and then Paul Skeens on the mound Tuesday.
I mean, this is the biggest 3-game series in the Cherington Shelton era. I don't think you can really debate. I think this is the biggest week of this regime in Pittsburgh when you consider what's at stake here. I mean, they've got 6 games against 2 teams ahead of them in the playoff race. And if they go 4-2, 5-1 here, you are in the driver's seat for the rest of the season, because you will have leapfrogged 2 teams ahead of you, one of them being in your own division. So yeah, this is huge. I think it's incredibly ideal that they were able to take 2-3 from the Phillies, remain over 500, and now you go into these 2 games with your 2 aces on the mound Monday and Tuesday. That's great. Now the Cardinals have had Mitch Keller's number. 2 of his 5 losses this season have come against the Cardinals, but I mean, this is why you pay him $77 million to go out there and be this guy that you trot out there. This is why you take Paul Skeens number 1 overall to be pitching in big games like this. And their path is crystal clear. And if you go out there and you win, you're in a really good spot. Now, if you go out there and you lose this series, and if you go to Arizona and you lose that series, you kind of fall back down. But it's, like I said, these are the 6 most important games in Ben Cherington's 5 years as the GM here, and Derek Shelton's 5 years as the manager here. Really, this is the most meaningful baseball this team has played since acquiring Chris Archer in 2018. That's where we're at right now, and it might even be more meaningful than that because they're closer. They're deeper in the mix than they were back then. So I think it's huge. I'm excited to see what kind of turnout shows up at PNC Park for these games, and there should be a big crowd because this is big time baseball. And if they go out there and like I said, win 5 of these next 6, then you have an even more of an argument to maybe not just get minimal additions, but a big addition or something like that. So it's big. It's big. I don't know what to expect because the Cardinals and the Pirates, typically when they meet up with a big game on the line, we know how that's gone. But this is a new group, so we'll see how that unfolds. But it's very exciting.
You hear that, Pirates fans? There's big baseball in town, so show up at PNC Park, and we'll see the excited crowds there to get all the coverage there. Read all the work from our guys Noah Hiles and Andrew Destin here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Noah, thanks so much for joining us here in the North Shore Drive podcast. We'll hear from you guys on Wednesday as we get closer, as we get to see more of what happens in this Cardinals series and get ready for them to get on the road there again. Thanks again, Noah, and thanks again to Brian Batko for joining us here in the North Shore Drive podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Carter Critiques. Read all of our work at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, post-gazette.com to get all the written work from all of our sports writers. We're back Wednesday with more here on the North Shore Drive podcast. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all the sports coverage from the Post-Gazette that we have to offer, visit post-gazette.com.